Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled Editor's Tips on Revising Your Manuscript and Query Letter with Ricardo Fayet, co-founder of Reedsy. Ricardo is the co-founder of Reedsy, a global network that connects authors and publishers with top editorial design, marketing, and ghostwriting talent. A technology and startup enthusiast, he likes to imagine how small players will build the future of publishing. He is behind the launch of Reedsy's latest initiative, Reedsy's Learning, a series of free mini courses on writing, publishing, and marketing taught by Reedsy's best professionals and delivered in your email box each day. Okay, Ricardo, I'm going to unmute you and you can begin your presentation as soon as you're ready. It looks like I unmuted you, but I'm not hearing you. Unmute. Ricardo, you might want to go back there and do that. I don't know why that's not working. Ah.
That's good. It's all good. You should hear me now, right?
Yep, we can hear you good.
Perfect. Well, thanks everyone. Sorry for the slight problem before, but I'm sure you enjoyed our conversation with the technical problems. So welcome to the webinar on editor's tips on revising your manuscript and query letter. So as Sue said, I'm the founder of Reedsy, so that's me. Well, I've got a beard now, but it's still me in there. And you can find me on Twitter at Ricardo Fayet. Now, I'm not going to be doing most of the talking today because to talk about querying and submitting to publishers and revising your manuscript, I've kind of invited 5 of our top editors from the Reedsy network. So they're here on this beautiful slide. So it makes it think like they come from all over the world, really, from the UK and the US. So Scott Back is an associate editor at Unbound, a crowdfunding publisher in the UK, really interesting model. And also a former publisher at HarperCollins UK, Katrina, is in New York, I believe, and former editorial assistant Simon Schuster. Jim's former editorial director at Random House, and Constance is a lead editor at independent press, Three Rooms Press. And finally, we'll have the perspective of a literary agent as well, Erin Young. So if you signed up for this webinar, you're probably familiar with one of the main problems of authors nowadays is that, well, you gotta find an agent if you want to find a publisher, because as you can see here on the right, most big 5 imprints are now close to unagented submissions. And if you want to find an agent, most well-known agencies receive around 100 or 200 query letters every day. So I got this stat from, I think, Nelson Literary Agency in the US, and she was getting 140 queries every day per average over a year. So the big question becomes, how do you stand out? How do you make sure that the agent or the publisher reads your submission, hopefully gives you feedback on it, and in the best case scenario, takes you and represents you or decides to publish your manuscript? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start with a query letter and then slowly progress towards revision tips and especially first few pages of your manuscript. So we'll tackle how to start a query letter, how to research agents you're going to send it to, and how to kind of organize your querying process so that you can act on agents' feedback as you send your query letters. Then, in terms of revision, we'll take a close look at your first few pages, especially your manuscript opening, what common errors to look for during your revision, and then how and when to involve an editor if you want to do that. So to start with, I thought I'd simply ask our panel for kind of the most common mistakes they see authors make when it comes to querying agents submitting to publishers. So I sent them this question in advance, and they sent me a few answers. So I'm just going to ask them to kind of comment on what you can see here on the screen. So Constance, what's the biggest mistake that you see authors make when it comes to approaching agents? And don't forget to unmute.
So as I say, rudeness and arrogance are usually the biggest mistakes I see. I get a lot of queries and submissions where the author insults either the press or me or the comparable books that they list. Or they come across and they say like, oh, this is going to be the next Harry Potter or something like that, and it just strikes the wrong chord. And so yeah, it's a huge mistake, I see.
Thank you. Cool. What are the biggest mistakes for you, Katrina? Don't forget to unmute. I'm not sure we can hear you. Did you unmute?
She is unmuted according to this. Katrina?
Better? Can anybody hear me?
Now we can.
Yeah,
barely.
now we can hear you.
Okay. Hold on a minute. Let me see if I can help this out.
All right. Maybe you want to jump to Scott and we come back to you?
Sorry.
No problem.
That's okay.
All right.
I'm assuming you can hear me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, apart from not being rude to Constance, which I don't think anyone should ever do, to be honest, my biggest mistake that authors make is simply not following the guidelines. If an agent or a publisher welcomes submissions, then they're going to make it very clear on their website that they do that. They're also going to give you some rules and guidelines to follow. They're usually very simple. They might be quite specific, but follow them. For goodness sake, just follow them. If they want a synopsis of no more than 500 words, don't send them a 600-word synopsis. You are not the exception that proves the rule. So it's a simple one. If the publisher or agent has guidelines, follow them.
That makes perfect sense. Erin, what's the biggest mistake for you?
So I do see a lot of work submitted that is not fully edited. And it's funny because I actually get a lot of queries in which people say, oh, I know it needs some editing, but we can deal with that once you've signed me. And I don't think that people realize that it needs to be as fully edited as possible. And in most cases, you only get one chance. Agents don't want to see you querying them over and over again. So you need to make sure that you're fully ready to submit before you submit.
That's good advice as well. And Jim, the biggest mistake for you?
Hi, everyone. When I used to receive query letters, it makes you shake your head a little bit when you get one that goes too deeply into the weeds of a story, excuse me, into the plot, when what you really need right up front, in as briefly said as possible, is your elevator pitch, your 2- or 3-line pitch that combines why the work in question is familiar, why the acquirer would recognize it, and then why it's a twist on what's recognizable or familiar. So you right away are providing to the acquirer the context within which to see the work, and then also here's why it's really notable, noteworthy, and worth your time. So to focus on that rather than to let me tell you about these characters and in this setting and so forth.
Yeah, and we'll get more into the hook in just a minute. Katrina, did you manage to sort out the mic?
Can you hear me now?
Sounds like you're far away, but we can hear you a little bit.
Okay. I'll try speaking really loudly. Sorry about this inconvenience, everybody. I think the most common thing I see with authors that they don't actually realize they're doing wrong is first submitting to publishers that don't accept unsolicited manuscripts. That's a very hard and firm rule. So if you need to be agented for one of the big 5, they will not look at something that you just send directly to them. And the other thing too is not really doing enough research into the genre and understanding what agents are interested in which genres and what that means, and how that can benefit you if you actually get that right.
Yeah, two common mistakes indeed. So now that I've been going over these mistakes, let's try to see how you can get things right. And so we'll start with the start of the query letter. Now, if you've read advice out there on queries and submissions, you'll probably know that there's kind of two currents of advice right now on how to start a query letter. Some people will tell you that it needs a hook first so that the agent keeps reading, so something interesting. And some other people will tell you to start with personalization, so explaining why you're sending that query to that agent, why they're the ones that should be representing your manuscript, even if, of course, you're sending it to more than one agent. So when I asked our editors, or 5 editors, this question, is it hook or personalization, got very different answers. So I've decided to feature Jim and Constance, and maybe we'll start with Jim. Why is it the hook?
Yes, and maybe I have a misunderstanding of what how you were referring to personalization. I was thinking of that as this is who I am, or this is what I'm doing, versus this is why I'm sending to you agent, which is it's an interesting angle. But for me, of course, just like I was talking about, it's got to be hook. I have to understand what the work is and why it's worth reading about and investing in.
What's a hook for you? How would you describe it? How would you kind of tell an author to write a hook?
Well, much along the lines of what I was just describing. To me, it's a 2-part construction. Part A is I need the context. Make me understand how it's familiar, where the work sits in the store, for example, what genre it is, what comp books. One of our fellow panelists just mentioned comparison titles. What are the comps, that kind of thing. And then, obviously, if it's too much like that, then it's not interesting either. So you need to give me part B, which is, and here's why my version of this is different, stands out, why you're going to enjoy it.
That's a good definition. Now, Constance, on personalization, why go for that?
Well, I think everybody really likes to be flattered. Maybe I'm wrong, but at an independent press where we don't actually get anywhere near as many submissions, I think it definitely makes you stand out to say, like, look, I actually read the books that you guys have published. I know exactly why I want to work with you specifically. As an editor, it makes you feel like they did their homework, and then they're not just sending you the same submission they sent to everybody else. So there's just that personal element that I really like, and even if it doesn't necessarily make me want to acquire that book anymore, it will at least encourage me to send them a more personalized rejection, maybe telling them some suggestions, or just thanking them for submitting to us and asking that they'll do it again.
That
Ricardo, could I quickly jump in on that? I completely agree with Constance about that. Absolutely right. I would also say that that in itself is a form of hook, and that it shows that the person sending to, in this case, an editor, has done the homework, which is also, of course, an incredibly important aspect when you're approaching an agency or a publisher.
Yeah, that makes sense. The personalization, there's not that big of a dichotomy. I kind of created it here, but of course, a strong personalization explaining why you're sending that manuscript to that agent is, in fact, kind of a hook. Erin, can we get your kind of agent perspective on it?
I don't know what it is. I generally like a personalized query letter. I think, like Constance said, it is a little bit of the ego. You like to see something that they looked you up and they know something about you. That being said, once I get into the story, your hook has to hook me. I'm not going to read any further if I don't like your hook. So, I mean, the personalization is nice, but the hook is probably the most important thing that you should work on.
That makes sense. So maybe start with the personalization and then really put a lot of work into the hook. Yeah, Katrina?
Oh, hi. So I actually agree along those lines a lot. I always recommend, from what I've seen, more towards personalization, but I will say that I think sometimes it depends on your genre. So if you're able to have like a really incredible hook for a psychological thriller, that might actually work individually better for your letter than doing the normal lead-in for personalization, though I would say that that's the default I usually recommend for all the reasons that everybody just mentioned.
Sounds good. Well, before I move forward, I imagine there's some questions coming in. I can't see them, but don't worry. We're kind of noting them down, and we'll tackle all the questions in the Q&A at the end. So don't worry, we're not answering them right away, but we'll get to them. So now, how to research agents and publishers. We mentioned in the most common mistakes that you need to do your research, the submission guidelines, and also one of the things that authors ask me the most is, where do I find a list of agents and publishers? So I kind of asked our panel about that and sent me a list of resources. So you'll get the slides afterwards. You'll be able to click on all these logos to access the website. So there's Writer's Digest, Publishers Weekly, Poets and Writers. They're all good websites to look for agents. Manuscript Wishlist as well has a list of agents and publishers. Authors Publish is a magazine that also sends a newsletter with kind of opportunities, so new independent publishers or imprints that open to submissions for a limited time. So if you get their newsletter, you'll know about that. Publishers Marketplace is one of the best resources, but you need to pay a subscription. And Submittable is slightly different, that it's a submissions platform. So it's kind of a technology platform that a few agencies and publishers have chosen as a way to receive submissions. And so if you sign up as an author to Submittable, you'll be able to view all the agencies and publishers that are open to submissions through Submittable. And it also makes it pretty easy to kind of send your submission. Now, I really like this tip from Erin when I asked her, because something I personally don't think about. There are a lot of genre-specific blogs that highlight agents looking for specific material. So maybe, Erin, you can tell us a little bit more about how to find those?
It's actually pretty easy. If you, you can Google whatever genre you're trying to get published in, and there are a lot of specific blogs out there. For example, one of the things that I look for is middle grade fiction, and there's a blog out there called Middle Grade Ninja that I was just interviewed for, and they ask the agent a few personalized questions, and it's material that you can use in your query letters, that personal information, and you can say, I saw you on this blog, and I saw you were looking for this. And sometimes they do ask you specific questions. What are you looking for right now? So you can get like a little bit more information on what that query or what that agent is looking for at that time.
Yeah, and it shows that you've done, I guess, your research if you've looked at interviews and you've seen what the agent is interested in. So that goes back to the personalization we were mentioning earlier. So I'll move on now to the process. You've identified a certain number of agents or publishers you want to send your work to. Obviously, you need to research what their guidelines are. You can't just send a mass email to everyone because everyone's going to have slightly different guidelines. So now the question becomes, do you send one query out to the dream agent you have and wait to hear back for maybe a year? Or do you send 30 queries at once, or do you send 5 and 5? So I've asked this question to our editors again, and I've highlighted the answers from Scott and Jim. So if you want to jump in on this, Scott, to start with.
Yeah, sure. I chatted to a lot of agent friends about this, and they pretty much all expect that you're not only going to be sending to them. I advise maybe 6 at a time. What you should absolutely do is prioritize the agents you want to send your work to, and you should be sending to your dream agent first. Don't send to your dream agent on the 10th or 15th time, because your dream may come true. It is possible. It's unlikely, but it is possible. So I tend to say 6 at a time because it's a manageable number. Keep a note of who you're sending to. By all means, keep a spreadsheet. And if you get a rejection, you can then send out to someone else on your list. So yeah, a multiple submission is absolutely fine.
Jim, what's your take on it?
Couldn't agree more. Exactly right. Do it in groupings, handfuls, and maybe, I don't know, time frame, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. I'm sure each agency posts a different amount of time before they return to you. Sometimes they never do, so you don't want to be hanging there waiting forever. So you'd measure your packets when they go out. And what I was thinking about was simply that if the writer is doing this for the first time, you're going to learn a lot from the process, things that you can't anticipate, and so meeting it out over time like this gives you time to adjust and learn as you receive feedback.
Yeah, and obviously you need to act on the feedback, or do you need to act on the feedback? If the agent mentions something in your manuscript that they say you need to change and that you don't completely agree with, should you change it? Should you not?
It's always important to be open to criticism and feedback, but it also needs to be judged. The writer needs to be fair about being able to receive that kind of feedback and thinking about it, but not all feedback, of course, should be paid attention to, because as many people or editors or agents as there are in the world is our perspectives on the work. So you can't just react to it without thinking. Thought is important. Reaction is important.
And I would add to that and say, actually, most of the time you're just going to get a very standard rejection. If someone has bothered to give you specific feedback, it's because they felt that would be of use. So I think Jim's absolutely right. You've got to take it with good grace. But at the same time, if someone's bothered, if an agent or publisher has bothered to take the time to give you feedback, it's definitely worth listening to. You may choose to ignore it long term, but it's definitely worth paying attention to.
And that's one of the points we're going to mention now, is that, yeah, most of the time you don't get an answer or you get a standard rejection letter. So one of the questions, again, I get most often from authors who come to Reedsy and often who suddenly decide to self-publish is, I've queried 30 agents or 50 agents and I haven't had one personalized rejection. So when you're in this case scenario and you really want to go through the traditional publishing route and find an agent, then a publisher, what are your options? So Constance, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, my honest to goodness advice is that, sure, it's very possible that the book just wasn't right for that particular person or the people that you sent it to. And it's possible that it is actually perfect, it's a great book, but it wasn't right for them. Or it's quite likely that you're missing something in your first few pages. You didn't like hook them, you didn't interest them. So I would suggest going back and looking over specifically the first few pages to see if you can make it more compelling. Like maybe you had a typo in your first sentence, or maybe maybe it just wasn't grabbing them so that they didn't want to keep reading to the end of the book. So I suggest specifically looking at that part, but I would also suggest looking over the entirety of the book, because as I think it was Erin said, a lot of people do send out books that are not completely edited or to the best of their ability edited. So I look it over now with fresh eyes to see if you notice what the agent or the publisher might be picking up and saying like, oh well, I don't want to edit that. There's too much work required. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely, yeah. And obviously go over your submission one more time and make sure you avoided all the common hurdles we mentioned before, because if you're being rude in your query letter, no one's going to answer you, obviously. Or maybe they're going to answer you angrily, in which case it's a good indication that you're doing something wrong. So I like also the first tip on this slide that I think Katrina sent me when I asked her this specific questions. What can I do when I haven't received any answer from 30 agents? Don't hesitate to ask for feedback. So Katrina, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that sometimes when you receive either a standard rejection, well, if you receive one that's personalized, obviously they took the time to do so, but if you receive a standard rejection, I think authors, find it tough to sort of gather the courage to ask for specifics. It's hard to be criticized even constructively, but I think it's worth doing. So I think that, editors don't editors and agents don't see that as often when they come back and ask, and you never know what you might get. You know, you might not get any kind of response, but it doesn't hurt to ask, and if you do, you might get something that really gives insight into something you can work towards. So whether, you know, it's about your structure, or it was about your opening pages, or any of these things that we're saying can be sort of standard problematic areas, it's good to ask, and I think not enough people do that.
Yeah, I agree with that. It cannot hurt to send another email very gently asking for a bit of feedback. And now the tip number 2, and here I think comes from Erin, which is to build personal connections. Am I right?
Yeah, so generally, like, a rule of thumb is that if you have met somebody at a conference or out in the world, you're going to read their query. If they say, you know, I met you here at this conference, you're going to acknowledge that meeting and read their query. And there are so many other ways to do it besides just conferences. You can meet them through social media, and lots of other ways, through friends who have an agent and they can introduce you or refer you to their agent. And that really helps because, you know, a lot of times we're just looking for a connection ourselves, and somebody that we know has gone the extra mile to get to know us is somebody that we're going to trust.
And it goes back to personalization in a way. If you kind of do the work of researching the agent, even meeting them in person, again, it kind of flatters their ego because you've taken the time to go to a conference to meet them. So I think that's definitely a good strategy. Now, number 3 is consider seeking the opinion of a professional editor, and obviously all 5 panelists today are also professional freelance editors who work with authors to help them on their way to querying agents and publishers, and we'll be talking about that just a bit later, unless someone wants to step in right now. Cool. So now over to kind of the manuscript. One thing that Constance mentioned is look at it with fresh eyes, and especially take a look at the opening pages of your novel. So this is what we're going to look now. And interestingly, back in January, we did a post on the Reedsy blog where we asked several of our editors for ideas on how to kind of start a novel. And so none of them were one of the 5 panelists today, but they still had good ideas for opening a novel that I would like to get our panelists' opinion on. So the first one was, I'll start with the one in the middle, starting with action. So opening, as they say in Latin, in media res, so in the middle of the action. It's something I see more and more today in books, so I guess it's a good tactic. Does anyone want to talk about it?
It's Jim. Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing I see about that is it's visual and visible, a lot of detail, all of which are sort of standard good writing. So it's nice to have that in your first sentence, William Golding. And, you know, fair hair lowered himself. If there's action, you can see it in front of your eyes. Last few feet of rock, began to pick his way toward the lagoon. So I actually don't think that's a stunner of a first sentence, but it's at least very clear visually, and it draws a reader in immediately.
So would you favor starting in the action, or rather more in a more descriptive way?
I think it depends on the book and the project and the writer, and what serves the story best, and perhaps which approach the writer can best affect. I couldn't choose between the two in absence of more detail.
Makes sense. Now, I really like the first one, and came from one of our editors who said it's great to start within the action, but sometimes the action can be a little bit too strong and you don't want to kind of alienate the reader immediately in the first few pages. Instead, you can start with intensity, and I think the example is pretty good in that it sets the novel pretty intensely. Now, the last example we have here is my favorite one, is starting with the unexpected. So it's kind of a hook in and of itself in the first sentence of the novel. So now I'm going to ask our 5 panelists, starting with Katrina. What are your favorite ways to kind of open a novel, or what are the ways that you see working best out there? And I know it depends on the book.
Yeah, so in effect to what Jim said, I think it depends on the context of the book, what you're writing in and what your goal is with the opening. But I think the most common thing that I recommend is that you have to immediately make the reader care. So one of my, I don't do it anymore, but one of my previous practices as a reader when buying books in a bookstore was opening and reading the first sentence, perhaps the first paragraph, and I would decide to buy sheerly off of that. And so the idea behind that is that you really, out of all the hooks in the book, your first sentence is your biggest. So whether you are going with intensity or action or the unexpected, avoid being, for lack of a better word, boring. You know, you really want to introduce us to your world or your character or your voice immediately. So whether it's a character-driven novel and it's really the voice that we see on the first sentence, or it's a plot-driven novel and it's sort of an explosion of action that hooks us, do that rather than talking about the sunset, which is something that an average person would see every day. You'd have to describe that really intriguingly for that to stand out, and that's the biggest thing I'd recommend with an opening.
Yeah, that makes sense. Or the weather is another common way to open novel, which I'm really not a fan of. Any other thoughts on this? Maybe Erin?
Yeah, I think starting out the story is an important thing, but I don't know. For me, it's not so much the first sentence as it is the first paragraph. Getting a good idea of where we are in the story. And I think what makes a really good first sentence is something that can put you right in the story right away. And whether you can do that with action, intensity, or the unexpected, as long as we're immediately immersed and we know where we are in the story, that's the most important part.
Yeah, and these are only 3 out of kind of 9 ideas to start a novel that we had in the post that I highlighted here. So obviously there are lots of ways you can start a novel, and depends on the book and depends on the genre. But I think the idea is try something original that hooks the reader in the first sentence or in the first paragraph. If you can do that. Does anyone else want to jump in on this, or should we move on?
I would only go ahead, Scott.
Thanks. Sorry, Jim. Thank you. I would just say, being honest, I worry a little bit that sometimes writers submitting to agents and publishers focus too much on things like this. What should they do? In reality, a huge amount of the books that we get submitted just aren't great. They're not for us. So when I read the first page of a manuscript, I just want to read good writing, and it's a relief when I find it. So I'm not so bothered about the first line or the first paragraph, although I think they are important. If I read great writing, if I read something that I want to continue reading, then that's fantastic. So the people listening, I wouldn't say don't get too worried if you don't have an amazing first line or amazing first paragraph. They're important and they can help, and in certain genres they certainly do that more than others. But I get sent a lot of stuff that's not very good. So when I open a first page of a manuscript and the writing's great, that's good enough for me.
Jim?
Sure. That I agree with everyone who's spoken. I was going to say that I can't count the number of times I've said the first sentence is the most important sentence, the first paragraph is the most important paragraph, and the first chapter is the most important chapter, other than the final chapter. But of course, you have to get through the whole book to get to the final chapter. While at the same time agreeing completely with Scott, if the writing is intriguing, it'll pull a reader through. And I would also add that finding that first sentence and first paragraph is a process. Few people hit upon it the first time, just like the rest of what the manuscript, working the manuscript, which I'm sure we're talking about today. Many writers will go through an evolution of a process and discover that first sentence and first paragraph over time as you keep shifting things around and finding what works.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's not set in stone when you write the first sentence or the first paragraph. You need to be open to revising it, also depending on the feedback you get or the lack of feedback you get. And it will generally evolve as you write the manuscript. A lot of times will change that opening scene. I know a lot of authors who have a very hard time kind of writing that opening scene because they keep rewriting it until it's perfect, or they think it's perfect. Right, moving on to, well, the whole of the book. So one thing, obviously, that we mentioned a lot of times so far is do not send a book that's not polished or as polished as it can get. So do not send a first draft, do not even send a second draft. Go through the manuscript until you feel you can't really add more to it in terms of revision, and try to look for a few specific things, again, common mistakes, common hurdles that authors fall upon. So these 6 ones that I've highlighted here are, I think, all fairly common. Again, they come from a post that we did on our blog a few months ago with advice from other editors, but I thought let's put them in and see which ones our panelists would comment on. So it's starting with Katrina.
So a lot of these I find are very common as of lately, whether it's a trend or not. And you guys did a great blog article on this, actually. So viewpoint or point of view can be hugely problematic, especially when writing between third-person limited or third-person omniscient. And so I think that that's something I tend to attack when I'm revising authors, and it's something to be aware of when you are writing. So when you write in a viewpoint, stick to that viewpoint that you were writing in. You know, don't go from a third person to a first person. Don't go from a past tense to a present tense. I think that's a huge one, and I'd also say show, don't tell is really big. You know, show us and allow us to lead ourselves to your conclusions rather than telling them, and that has to do with something called front running as well, or heavy foreshadowing, where, you know, readers are really intelligent at the end of the day, and so while guiding us there is important, telling us beforehand and then sort of laying out all the steps to get to the final big twist, I don't recommend, and that's part of the show don't tell as well as on the line level.
Yeah, and one thing I'd say is that obviously we're going to touch on all these now, but they're pretty heavy subjects, all of them on their own, so do your research, look at blog posts on each and every one of these topics and understand what show don't tell means, what third omniscient is, what third limited is, what the dangers of third omniscient and third limited can be, or writing in first person, and things like that, so that you understand kind of what the common mistakes are, and you can go through your manuscript thinking about these mistakes and try to spot them if you've made them. Now, with that said, Jim, you did a great presentation on show don't tell for us, but maybe you want to pick another one this time.
Sure. But quickly about show don't tell, to go back to what I was talking about with William Golding's opening, that's a great example of show. Right here in the presentation that we have. The metaphor I often use, which is a little bit perverse, is the movie. Sitting in a movie theater, which nobody does anymore, sitting on your couch and watching a movie, the viewer receives all sorts of information because it's a visual format. Well, in a book, it's the author's job to communicate all that information that's coming into a movie viewer's eye. So that's one of the ways the metaphor I use to boil down show don't tell. The writer has to work hard to get that information in. Unbelievable conflicts I was looking at was just making me think of the words forced or contrived. That's just my take on unbelievable conflict. It jumps right out of a story. Readers can see it coming a mile away. If the writer really wants a certain plot point to happen, a moment in the story to happen, and warps what would be the authentic or organic fabric of the story in order to make it happen, somehow breaking rules about what the characters would do believably or who they have been shown to be in the story, and basically force them to do something that jumps right out. And it's the kind of thing that, as a writer, you have to build in a little bit of a second guess yourself, or you come back to it in revision or after you've been away for a while and try to see it. Or the great way is, of course, to be in a writing group and have other people who can give you feedback about that, all pre, of course, hiring one of us to help you.
Of course. Scott, do you want to talk about one of these?
Yeah, actually, a couple of edits I've done recently on Reedsy, I've had to pick up on dialogue tags. So for those of you who don't know what we mean, when you're writing some dialogue, you usually say, blah, 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 Scott said. And using said most of the time is absolutely fine. And it's fine for a very particular reason, in that actually readers ignore it. We know how dialogue works, and when we read a book, we actually tend to ignore dialogue tags. I think when you get to disruptive dialogue tags, when you try and perhaps be a bit clever, and it's often a sign of overwriting, when you replace said with, you know, blah, 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 Scott mused, or Scott muttered pensively, or whatever it might be, all of a sudden it actually takes the reader out of the book. We're so used to ignoring the word said that when we have to pay attention to the dialogue tag, it actually breaks up the dialogue a bit. And it's a classic example of amateur writing, or perhaps someone trying to overwrite. That and overuse of adverbs are the two things that leap off a page to me, often in the first page or two. The great news is, as an editor, I can help people with that. But if you're submitting to an agent, you want to be beyond that point. You don't want to have those mistakes in there, really.
And that's an interesting point, because we've mentioned dialect tags in a couple of posts, and there was a lot of kind of controversy in the comments, because apparently people really like not using said and using something else. I was wondering, does anyone else here on this panel think that using something else than said is okay? Nope. All right. Well, that's clear enough, I think. So stick to said, because that kind of focuses the attention of the reader on the dialogue rather than the word you're using to express the dialogue. All right, Erin, do you want to talk about one of these?
So one of the things that, as I edit, I notice most often are unbelievable conflicts, which are actually a lot trickier, I think, than a lot of people realize. Because as writers, we're trying so hard to show and not tell, as number one says. And I think a lot of times a writer will completely understand what they're trying to show, whereas the reader might not be able to see that. So if they're trying to show that somebody is jealous, the reader might not pick up on that. And so when that jealous person then gets in a fight with another girl, or another boy, if that is not obvious, then they're not going to understand what the conflict is. So I think you have to be careful when showing to make sure that you're showing the right things and to show exactly what you want to show. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's not quite as easy as you would think, the unbelievable conflict. So I think what I'm trying to say is that that's why having an editor or having beta readers and having people read over your manuscript is so important, because what you may see so easily may not be easily seen by other people.
Absolutely. I think it's about striking a balance, and I mean, everyone says show don't tell, and it's probably the most common writing advice out there, but we still, I mean, you could write a several thousand-word blog post about it, and we have a great presentation again from Jim, who talks at length about show don't tell on our blog. So it is a delicate subject, and it is about striking a balance. And of course, if you get an external opinion, either that of a professional editor or of a beta reader, that will help you understand whether you're showing what you want to show or not. Finally, Constance, I think you're the one I haven't asked about for this. Am I right?
Yeah. So I guess the only ones we haven't talked about are, I guess, misuse of tense, really. And honestly, I was thinking about that misuse of tense is kind of what I would consider a fairly basic copy editing issue, depending on how it's done. And honestly, it doesn't tend to bother me that much when looking at a submission, because tense is something I personally struggle with as a writer too, so I guess I understand it, and it's a fairly easy change from past tense to present or whatever you're doing. I would caution you not to misuse tense too often, but if you just kind of get confused, it's not that big of a deal to me personally.
No, that makes sense, yeah, because I purposely added one in there that's more to do with copy editing than developmental to see if it would bother anyone. It's the last one that's been picked, apparently. So it just, no, it doesn't really bother anyone. So yeah, there are. We'll go into the kind of editing process afterwards and different between developmental, copy editing, proofreading, and we said that obviously your manuscript should be as polished as can be when you send it out to agents and editors, but what you should really focus all your revising energy and your interaction with beta readers and you're working with an editor on is developmental editing issues, so things that are going to affect the structure of your story, the plot, the characterization, as we mentioned, the dialogue, and maybe focus less on copy editing issues like misuse of tense or grammar, punctuation, things like that. Obviously, if you make too many mistakes in terms of punctuation, it's the person reading the book, the agent's not going to be able to focus on your story. So you cannot abuse any kind of mistake, but focus on the developmental rather than the copy editing. Anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say that with the copy editing and the proofreading stuff, it mostly shows like if you have too many copy editing or proofreading issues, it shows that you might not care, whether that is your intention or not. But what we are focusing on more is going to be the developmental stuff.
Right, that makes sense. And it's often something you're more aware of as a writer in terms of a mistake. You know that, you know, fairly quickly whether you're good at grammar or not, and it's something you can correct more easily, whereas show don't tell, you can be telling throughout the whole book and not be aware of it at all. So that's where the input of beta readers and editors is most valuable. All right, so we got there. Consider working with a professional editor. So that's one of the probably most important advice I got when I asked our panelists for kind of revision tips and tips before you approach publishers. So I featured Katrina here when I asked her for her #1 advice for authors looking to query agents and publishers. Now, of course, this kind of brings the question of, let's say me as an author, I want to query agents, I want to query publishers. Oftentimes the reaction I get is, aren't agents and then editorial kind of directors or commissioning editors supposed to do the editing? Isn't it their job? And maybe Katrina, you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it is tough for authors out there. I think the idea is too that there are multiple venues to do this. So I always recommend a professional editor if an author is comfortable with that early on, mainly to hit those developmental issues. But as everybody talked about, writers groups are great ways to sort of evaluate your manuscript fairly early. Beta readers are also another great way to do so. I think for people who want to be, whether you're doing traditional publishing or not, you really should have someone who is familiar with, familiar with manuscripts as a whole, and the way that things can be crafted in a more, smoother, natural way, to improve your writing. And that's what I really mean when I say that I really recommend you going to a professional editor. But there are other avenues. Now, regarding the question of isn't that their job in, a publishing house or anything like that, I mean, yes, but to get there, if your manuscript is riddled with sort of very large developmental issues that you maybe aren't seeing yourself because you don't have enough perspective from the work, you can't get there to do it. And because of how competitive the market is with agents, and then again on the publishing house level, you want to give yourself the best chance. You want to sort of give yourself a foot up, and that's why I tend to recommend it.
That makes sense. Scott, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think editors at publishing houses these days are, if we're honest, they're project managers. They do editing, and that is part of their job, but it's not their sole job. They're usually helping to manage a book through a whole process. But everyone's going to want to have their say on the book, so your agent will help you with an edit. Your editor will help you with an edit, but it's about getting it as good as it can possibly be. It's not a case of, well, I think this is okay, let's chuck it out there and someone else can work on it once they've accepted it. You want to get accepted, so you want your manuscript to be as strong as possible. And getting beta readers, working with a writing group, working with a professional editor are all ways of doing that. At least when you work with a professional editor, you know that that person has published books before and knows what it takes to make a book work, and that sort of professional experience can help. It's not 100% essential, but it can certainly help.
All right, well, just moving on so that we can get to the questions. I'll just talk a little bit about finding an editor. So as we said, there are other possibilities. There are beta readers, but the great advantage with an editor is that it's someone who's often if worked at a traditional publisher or publishing company before, or has had contacts with agencies or their agents. As you can see, our 5 panelists all have extensive traditional publishing experience, and they're all also freelance editors. So these are the kind of people you should be looking for. Now, on kind of tips on finding the right editor, so first thing is to look for recommendations or to search for them on reputable websites. So that's what Reedsy is for. And then obviously asking for testimonials, recommendations, looking at the portfolio, what they've edited, what they've worked on, does it kind of make sense considering the genre you're writing in, and then doing a background check. So on Reedsy, we actually do that for you, but if you're going somewhere else, then make sure you do a background check about on the editor. Then when you're reaching out to editors, similarly as when you're reaching out to agents, you need to include a certain amount of information. So the type of editing you're after, we'll talk about that in a second, your genre, your synopsis, and one very important thing is a target market, and that's something that I see a lot of authors forget about when they reach out to editors on Reedsy, is saying who the book is intended for, because that kind of shows that you know who your audience is. And obviously an editor can help you, developmental editor can help you figure that out, but you should have an idea of who you're writing for. And obviously a sample of your book so that they can take a look at your writing. Now, last tip is that good editors are usually booked out months in advance, and they also don't enjoy rush up. So make sure you don't reach out expecting them to book you into their schedules next week. They're often booked several months in advance, so reach out early on. And if you really want to work with the best, you might have to wait a little bit, but it's gonna be worth it. And finally, probably the most important tip on this slide is don't send in your first draft for developmental editing. Same as don't send an agent an unpolished manuscript. Don't send even a freelance editor who you're going to pay an unpolished manuscript, because if you do that, they're going to pick up all the obvious mistakes you've made and that you haven't tackled in a revision. So you're going to be paying for something that, well, you could have done a lot of the job yourself, or with a beta reader by going through your manuscript. So revise your manuscript, your second draft, third draft, work with a beta reader, work with a writers group, and then involve an editor when you've gotten to a point where you feel you can't make the manuscript any better on your own, or involve an editor when you've queried 20, 30 agents and gotten no answer and have no idea why you're getting no answers. That's definitely the right time to look for an editor. Now, in terms of the different types of editing, again, you'll have the slide, so you'll be able to go more in depth into that. But there are three, let's say, main categories we've identified on Reedsy. And now, bear in mind that depending on the country and on the editor, they'll have kind of slightly different definitions. But we've segmented into developmental editing, copy editing, proofreading. And as we said before, developmental editing is all about the bigger pictures. So if there are any major restructurings to do in your story, any plot holes that identify concepts to clarify for nonfiction, characterization is a big thing, viewpoint, all the kind of mistakes we mentioned earlier, except for the misuse of tense, are ones that are tackled by a developmental editor, and they can tackle it either through an editorial assessment, so that's reading your manuscript and then producing kind of a one-off report, an edit letter on all aspects of your manuscript and things you need to improve and things that you don't need to improve that are good. Or through a developmental edit, so more line by line and adding comments in the margins. I'm surprised no one has stopped me yet to say that they have different definitions. Cool, then copy editing is more, as I said, focus on grammar, punctuation, also attention to style, tone, and kind of fact-checking. So I purposely left a few typos in there in case there was any copy editor in the audience who wanted to point them out. So I'm sure someone's mentioning them in the comments. But it's more about, yeah, making sure that it's fact-checking, not fast-checking. And the proofreading is just a last check to the manuscript, and really important because developmental editors, copy editors are going to miss certain typos, certain misspellings that are going to be caught just in the last check, or maybe through certain changes in the manuscript they're going to actually introduce mistakes, because that happens, everyone makes mistakes, and so you need a last check that focuses just on grammar, spelling, punctuation, and making the whole manuscript error-free. Does anyone from our panelists not agree with what I just said?
I agree entirely.
Okay, good. I'm getting better at this.
I agree, but I think one of the things that I see a lot are people coming and saying, oh, I want developmental editing, copy editing, and proofreading. And I don't think that people realize that an editor can't do all of these in one step. And they are 3 or 4 even different steps that require going back into the manuscript.
I see that all the time too.
Yeah, I get that a lot as well.
I also agree with that.
And I think it's people not necessarily understanding the process. 99% of the time, they're fine once you explain it, but actually getting to the nub of what it is they want you to work on can take a couple of emails.
And what I would say too is that I actually, I don't disagree with any of the categorizations you did, Ricardo, but I usually put editorial assessment as the first step of developmental, actually, depending on the manuscript. Because if it's going to need major restructuring or major rewriting, I usually allow the author to do that before I tackle the line level. So that's just like a deeper aspect of what developmental editing can be, and like everyone's talking about, it can be often 4 stages to do all of these.
The only thing I would add is that often my experience is that a writer may not necessarily be able to assess exactly what they need. It can sometimes be difficult to choose one of these categories, and what I found is that what ends up happening is we just get into the work, and that's where the return is. Get the manuscript over to somebody and start to dig into it.
I agree, and sometimes I will do a full editorial assessment, developmental editing, and copy editing, where I'm going into the lines and into different like sections of the novel and giving track edits, while also giving an overall developmental editing letter. So I think that sticking with these guidelines can be pretty difficult depending upon needs of the manuscript.
Absolutely. So, I mean, these are terms that come from traditional publishing, and because you need to kind of have some categories. But depending on what your manuscript needs, depending on the editor you go for, these kind of differences are not set in stone, and certain editors work differently. So make sure you kind of scope out the product in advance, and also trust your editor to know what your manuscript needs most. Now, one thing is I want to say is, for submission to agents and publishers, focus on developmental things, because as I said, they'll forgive some copy editing and proofreading errors in your first few pages, but if there are any kind of glaring plot holes or viewpoint errors or things like that, definitely not gonna take on your submission. So quickly moving on, you'll get this slide. We did an infographic last year on kind of the cost of editing. So basically on Reedsy we have 500 really professionals who we vetted, and a lot of editors who come all from traditional publishing, and so we wanted to have an idea a little bit of what they charge. So we went through all the quotes and kind of found averages. Now, these are to give you an idea of what you can expect in terms of quotes. If you're a first-time writer, never kind of has contacted freelance editors before, now expect to see widely different numbers depending on how much work your manuscript needs and on how the editor works. Obviously, if they're going to do an editorial assessment, developmental editing, copy editing, in one collaboration, it's going to be more than just this number for developmental editing. But this, we found, can give you a pretty good idea of how much to budget for developmental editing or an editorial assessment. Does anyone widely disagree with these figures? No? Okay, all right, I'll move on because I know Jim might have to leave soon. So quickly, what is Reedsy? Because I know we hinted at it, explaining that oral panelists came from Reedsy, that we produced infographics, blog posts, and things like that. So I thought I should tell you a little bit more about who we are. So we're a relatively young company, and we built kind of a creative community of authors and professionals. So we now have closer to 30,000 authors and 500 professionals. Now, the professionals you'll find on our marketplace, so editors, designers, marketers, publicists. What you need to know is that they've been handpicked and vetted out of over 15,000 applicants so far. So there's a 3% acceptance rate. So we really look for people with traditional publishing background who've worked on a certain number of titles and who have kind of a genre specialization. So we generally won't take someone who says, I can copy edit or I can do a developmental edit on any kind of book, fiction, or nonfiction. So we've done over 1,600 projects now. I need to update this slide in the last 2.5 years. And as you can see, we've got people all over the world and also professionals all over the world. Our whole idea is to give authors kind of first the assurance that all the people they're going to contact through us are really good, and then also the ability to have choice over the people they hire. So you can contact up to, let's say, 5 developmental editors for an editorial assessment and a query letter review, and they usually answer within 48 hours with either more questions or comments or a quote. And now I'm just sharing a special link in here with you. So if you think you should work with an editor, if you want to take on that advice from today's presentation, feel free to sign up to Reedsy. You don't need to send a request, or you don't need to kind of hire anyone right away. But if you sign in before the end of the week through this link here, you'll get a $20 discount off your first collaboration with an editor. So feel free to sign up after the webinar. Again, I'll share the slides with you, so you'll get that link. You'll be able to click on it and sign up through it if you want to do that. Again, no need to hire an editor if you don't need one right now. Maybe you're going to need one in 6 months or in a year. But at least if you sign up now, you'll get these $20 credits, let's say, sitting in your account and waiting for you to work with someone. Now, to close this presentation off, I've asked our editors for their final tip, their #1 tip when it comes to approaching agents and publishers. And we're going to start with Jim, if you're still here, because I know you need to run away soon.
Sure. Thanks, Ricardo. Yeah, my quote here was basically what we've circled back around. We've come full circle because we were talking about personalization versus hook, and right after hook is do your homework, which is basically the personalization comment. Know where your book fits in, know who you're submitting to as much as you can. Panelists have talked about trying to find opportunities for rubbing elbows with people. Know what their work has been, what they're known for, which specific titles they've been responsible for, authors they've worked with, and hey, read a few of them.
Indeed, read a few of them. Right, thanks for that, Jim. Well, let's just start from the top now. So, Constance, your final tip?
Yeah, as we've discussed already in depth, get your manuscript to a point where it's as good as you can possibly get it on your own, or with your professional editor or your writing group. Because, yeah, that make it good so that we can help you make it better.
Awesome. Katrina?
So we talked about mine a little bit earlier, but what I will focus on at the moment is actually the have perseverance part of the comment. And, I think writing is incredibly hard. Like, everyone who writes a book already deserves, a commendation in my perspective for doing that kind of hard work, but that's not the end of it either. And so whether you're editing with a group, with beta readers, with a professional editor, even throughout the submission process, you're going to need a lot of perseverance and a lot of dedication to what you're doing. And I think it's important to keep that in mind so that you don't end up becoming discouraged.
Absolutely. Scott?
Yeah, so a bit like follow the guidelines, do your research, which I think we've all mentioned. Find out which agents and which editors are publishing which books. A little tip here, if you're finding it hard to track down individual agents or editors, if you go to the acknowledgement pages of books that you love, books that you feel are in the same sort of genre or area that you're writing in, then any author worth their salt will thank their agent and their editor in the acknowledgements page. So that's a good way to get some names.
Yeah, it's an excellent actionable tip for doing some research. Now, finally, Erin, so your quote actually came in with a really good example that I had to cut because it didn't fit on the page, but if you want to give that example, I think it illustrates pretty well.
Yeah, of course. That's one of my favorite stories. I don't think people realize how patient you need to be in this industry. I have a very good author friend who he submitted his query over 100 times, maybe. It took him 3 years to finally find an agent, and then a year to find a publisher. And this book went on to win the Prince Award. I mean, it's a great novel. Just because things aren't happening for you right away doesn't mean that they're never going to happen for you.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for that. We're now at the end of the presentation. You can see our little offices in London here. So don't forget about the link. Again, you'll get the slides, so you'll be able to click on it, or if you want to type it after this webinar in your browser, access it, and sign up through there. You'll get the slide after webinar, you get the webinar replay, and if you get any post-webinar questions, you can drop me personally a line, ricardo@reedsy.com, and I always answer. Now, we got a lot of questions during the presentation, so I had Maria working in the background, thanks Maria, to kind of send me the questions to make sure that we tackle as many of them as possible. Jim, do you need to leave, or can you stay, or?
I'm afraid I have to sign off, so I'll just say thanks to Ricardo and to everyone in the audience and to my fellow panelists. It's been a pleasure spending some time with you.
Thanks so much, Jim. Awesome. So first question, interesting one. Is it okay to re-query after revision and after a year or more has passed? Maybe Erin?
Yeah, a year is plenty of time. I would caution that you should tell that agent that you submitted before, just as long as they know. But a year is totally enough time. 6 months even is a good amount of time.
Even if you got a standard rejection letter?
Yeah, a lot of agencies will say in their guidelines that you can't ever resubmit, but most of them are pretty open, and they'll give you the timeline. They'll say 6 months to a year, whatever it is. But the most important is to make sure that they know that you submitted before and this is a revised version.
Makes sense. So now a question from Heidi, maybe for you, Scott. When choosing an agent and agency, are there ways to determine past successes by either revenues or number of books sold? So where might I find, for example, the total number of books sold by a specific agent over a 1 to 5 year period?
I don't think there is such a place, and I'd also say that that's not the sort of thing you need to be looking at. What you want to do is find an agent or a publisher who loves your book and is going to get behind it. I wouldn't worry too much about their sales. If you want to do sort of general research into the success or otherwise of agents and publishers, then read the trade press. Look at the trade websites, and you'll find out who's doing the big deals, which publishers are being successful, which editors are winning awards, that sort of thing. But I wouldn't worry too much about actual sales units because, well, first of all, you're not going to be able to find out because it's not the sort of data that's out there. But I wouldn't say that's a priority. I think finding someone who has agented or published some great books and who loves your book is by far the more important thing.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, there are some websites, and the ones we share, they're typically Publishers Marketplace is going to tell you all about the deals that are being made. But I'd suggest spending more time on kind of your manuscript than reading that press every day. Now, a question that I think is really important and that a lot of authors have by Marianne Scott. When is the right time to submit a query letter for your manuscript? So she's still in edit process, but she thinks it's going to be done in 1 month. When do you know it's time to kind of stop revising and editing and ready to start sending queries? Maybe Constance?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, when is the right time to submit a query letter for your manuscript? When should you stop kind of revising and saying, okay, it's time to query?
Well, I would say when you personally feel like it's done, and also at the point when you are kind of like mentally done with tinkering with it, because I know a lot of times when you think you're done, like the next week you'll be like, oh, I had this great idea, I should incorporate that. So when you're just tired of it, I think you should start submitting it to people, but not so tired that you are no longer enthusiastic about the project.
Yeah, no, of course, you need that enthusiasm to write a good query. Another question, but I love Ricardo's voice. Well, thanks for that. How vital is a social media presence during the querying process? Interesting. Do you find authors who already have a following more attractive? A question from Megan Parson that I'm going to ask to Erin.
I'd like to say that this is very important if you're writing nonfiction. It's what we think of as your platform, which just means how many people you can reach immediately. It's not very important for fiction. What's more important for fiction is the story. But having a huge following, if I would say like 20K or more, that's something that you should mention in a query letter.
Sounds good. And that's also, yeah, a question, kind of a worry I get a lot of from authors is they say agents really want you to have a big platform, big following on Twitter. It's not so much about the book anymore. That's not true, right?
No, definitely not. We always look at concept above the following, always. But having a huge following doesn't hurt. If you have a small following, I don't think that it's something you should worry about unless, like I said, you're writing nonfiction.
Yeah, it's the same as kind of following trade publications and deals. It's more important to spend time on the manuscript and perfecting the manuscript than growing your social media following or looking at deals done in the trade. Now a question on memoirs. I'm writing a memoir. Should I submit a query letter, a book proposal, or both? So who can answer that question? Just go ahead.
Scott here. I'll give it a go. Non-fiction can be a little bit different to fiction. With fiction, you're usually submitting a complete manuscript. With memoir, I would usually expect it to be complete, but with history or biography or other genres, it might not be. I would expect to receive a query letter and a proposal for a non-fiction work, and the proposal would include a summary, a chapter breakdown, and also some sample chapters. So I don't think I ever get sent just a query letter. There'll always be something to back it up. If the book is unwritten, as in you need to go out and research it, then you need to be very clear in the query letter that that's the case. Usually that sort of book is being written by a historian or someone like that, so you'd expect that. With a memoir, I tend to expect it to be pretty much complete.
Okay, cool. Maybe Scott, still for you, very quick, simple question. What is the good word length for a query?
Well, nowadays we say query letter, of course. Nowadays they're query emails most of the time. It needs to fit on a page. If it fits on a page of a Word document, that's long enough. It doesn't need to go over one page. I can't think of any query letter I've ever received that needed to be more than one page. Keep it short and snappy. We've talked about the sort of content that needs to be in there. It doesn't need to be very long. The rest of your material is the stuff we want to read. We actually want to get rid of the query letter pretty quickly, to be honest.
So does this mean that you should absolutely keep it to one page?
I would. I can't see any reason why you wouldn't. Any additional information can follow up later if the agent or publisher is interested. Yeah, I don't see any reason why it needs to be more than one page long.
Perfect. Now a question on children's books. Do any of the four of you have experience with children's books?
I do.
Okay, so one of the two projects Melissa Bergam is working on is a children's book, but she cannot draw. So does she need to find an illustrator on her own before querying an agent, or do agents help find an illustrator, or do publishers help find an illustrator?
Agents don't, unless they've already been working with an author and it's a special circumstance. Publishers will, but I will say that it's very hard to sell a picture book without already having illustrations. It's much harder than having a nicely illustrated, we call them dummies. So if you have a full dummy, it is a lot more impactful than just a written manuscript.
So you should look into working with an illustrator to at least produce a dummy before you query, right?
Yeah, it will help your case a lot if you can do that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Now a question on kind of transitioning from self-publishing to traditional publishing, or at least being represented. So if you self-published with all professional editing and book design, hopefully through Reedsy, how can you construct an effective query letter? Is it easier to see a complete work and make a decision as an agent? So that's a question from Darla Woodley. So basically, if you've self-published, how can you construct an effective query letter? Maybe to you, Constance?
I would say all the same rules apply. I would just mention that you've self-published it before and mention the reception that you had. If you got like a great number of reviews on Amazon or in the larger publishing world, I would mention that too. And then I would still submit only like your first 3 chapters or however much the submission guidelines require. I wouldn't send the entire ebook or a physical copy of the book at this time.
Yeah. And actually, I'll send this question to Katrina as well. Do you find, like, a worry I get often from self-publishing authors that once a manuscript is self-published, it's been published, so it's going to be near to impossible to find an agent or a publisher for it. Do you think that's still true or not?
I think nothing's impossible, especially with the way publishing is evolving in this day and age. I think that it can maybe be a little harder, but it doesn't mean that it can't happen, especially if you have a good work on your hands, and especially, like Constance mentioned, if it's well received already, that speaks a lot to your work, right? So I think you should always give it a try. I think, too, that you should look at your motivations as to why you are wanting to go traditional publishing after self-publishing, and vice versa, especially if you can do so earlier in the process. But again, I think it's worth doing it in either case.
Agreed. And any hints about so a question from Lydia Harris, any hints about developing a query when the story involves diverse characters and or topics or even lots of subplots? I'll send that question to Scott.
Thank you for that one. It can be hard to concentrate down a pitch and a synopsis when you've got a hell of a lot going on in the book. One piece of advice I often give people when they're trying to do that is actually to start their synopsis with just one sentence. If you had to summarize the book in one sentence, do it. Then allow yourself to add another 25 words. Then allow yourself to add another 50, and just expand it from the shortest it can possibly be. So that can help. I think if your book is very complex and has lots of diverse characters and plots and subplots, tell us. And we're used to that sort of thing. It's fine. So if the query letter says, this is a complex book, it's got lots going on, we'll then, if we read the sample, we want to just see if you can handle that. It's a very difficult thing to do, but tell us up front. I think that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, agreed. And another question on query that we get from several people, how can we know if a certain agent prefers hook or personalization? So I'll quickly take this one. So first, as we saw, personalization in and of itself can be a hook. And then we mentioned kind of blogs where they interview agents, genre-specific blogs, and often in the interviews they're going to ask agents on tips for query letters. So there are generally ways, also going to conferences and listening to agents' tips on the panels, there are ways to know what the preferences of a given agent are going to be and kind of act on those. Now, another question on the query letter.
Can I just jump in? Sorry, I'm very aware that often when we give advice, authors see it as set in stone, and I don't want people worrying too much about whether they should go with hook or personalization. Your cover letter, your query letter is going to be quite short. If it's well written and it has all the stuff in it, there isn't an agent or a publisher in the land that's not going to give you the time to at least introduce yourself. So don't worry too much. As long as you don't ramble on, and as long as your cover letter includes, a hook, a bit of a pitch for the book, and I understand why you're sending it to me, then hopefully I speak for everyone else here. We're very tolerant. We're not going to throw a cover letter away if the first sentence is not a hook, and we like the first sentence to be a hook. We have our preferences, but we also know that we need to be quite flexible in order to find some great books.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, the story in the end is always going to be the thing that determines whether an agent is interested or not. So again, that's where you should put most of your efforts in, right, even before determining whether it's hook or personalization. That is a personal preference of the person you're sending the query to. Now, a question from Heather Marson. I think this one's for Erin. Since authors are to send to only one agent within an agency, if the agent feels someone else in the agency would better serve the given manuscript, do the agents generally pass the query on?
I would say pretty much always. Of course, this could depend upon the agent, and you know, we're all human. Some of them might be lazier than others, but for the most part, if you have a good story and it's just not for them, and they see the potential in the story, they will pass it on to their coworkers.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think most agents are nice people, so if the query is good but it's not really for them and they know someone it is for, my guess is they'll pass it on. Erin, can you repeat the name of the middle grade blog that recently interviewed you?
It's called Middle Grade Ninja.
Middle Grade Ninja. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I'm getting so many questions. It's hard to pick them. All right. When a separate synopsis is not requested in guidelines, how long of a synopsis should be included in the query letter? Maybe Katrina?
Yes, so the query letter should always be no longer than 1 page in a Word document, even though you're going to be sending it an email. You don't have to worry about, like we've been talking about, you have to intrigue the person receiving the query letter more than you have to tell them the entirety of the synopsis. So usually it's crafted almost like back of the book, like cover copy, for example. It's more an overview, like a feel for your story, you know, getting us interested rather than telling us every single subplot, how it ends, everything like that. And so I wouldn't worry about that. If they want to know more, they will ask you for a synopsis, so I recommend having that ready on hand. But never send anything that they don't ask for, right? This follows what we've been saying about following the guidelines. So I would say don't worry about it too much. Keep everything to a page, and sort of the amount of plot that you give depends on how you're structuring your letter overall.
Cool. Now I've got a question I'm going to answer from Robert Mazzarelli. Where can I find a query coach? So someone who can challenge me personally and provide good feedback. Well, as I mentioned, some of our editors on Reedsy offer query letter reviews, the editors who are familiar with the query process. And I think all 5 editors on the panel today do offer this. So look for that on Reedsy. Now, a question again on the query. It sounds like, from Marianne, sounds like the smallest infraction results in rejection. Is it true that a typo in the query can disqualify you? Is it true, Erin?
No, not at all. I mean, if it's really blatant, and we might see it first, obviously, but we're probably going to read the whole thing anyway. I pretty much read all of my query letters until I see a part that I'm like, oh no, this is definitely not a book for me. And a typo is not going to stop that.
Yeah, sorry, I think that was just me being hyperbolic.
No, that's good. That's good to know. Well, honestly, going from more of a business perspective now, whenever you send a cover letter for a job or a query letter for a manuscript, it is 1 page of writing. So you do it is not that hard to make sure that within that 1 page there aren't any typos, and it's in your best interest to do so. But a typo is probably not going to disqualify you. But again, it's pretty easy to avoid.
The one time I would say it does is if you misspell your own title. That is a big red flag for me.
Yeah, no, that's you should definitely avoid.
I have gotten a lot of people spelling query wrong too. So sometimes I'll see that in the title line or in the subject line and be like, interesting.
And I've had people spell my name wrong, and there's only 9 letters there. It's not that tricky.
Yeah. You can take a look at websites like Query Shark that are going to kind of show queries and then the agent's feedback on the query to see kind of the common mistakes some more common than errors in the name of the agent or the title, things like that. Also for other things to avoid, but yeah, obviously make sure that you've spelled the name of the agent, the name of the editor, the title of your book, your name, right in the document. So how often do you read past a good query to the first few pages of the manuscript? A question from Molly Lawrence, which I am going to send to Katrina.
So if you've hooked in your query, then I feel like you absolutely will read into the pages, right? They're linked together. If your query has managed to capture attention, then of course, you know, an editor or an agent would read those pages, and then the job of those pages is to continue that interest, right? So if you've submitted a chapter or the first 3 chapters, whatever the guidelines require, that what you have given an editor or an agent will then be what allows them to want to read the rest of the manuscript. So I would say definitely.
Perfect. Now a question that's different from the query submission world. So it's a question from Lainey Belcastro again on children's books. So 3 years ago I signed with a small but global children's book publisher. I seldom request a status update, but when I do, she's aware of my work and advises I am in the illustrator's file moving up. Is this 3 years an acceptable time frame to wait for publication?
I think there's a lot. I'm confused by this question because I'm wondering, do you actually have a set date on which it should be published? Are you working with an agent, or is it just through yourself? And are they communicating with you at all? And I think if you don't have an agent, you need to really look into the contract that you have with this publisher and see what they promised you in the contract and make sure that they're following through with that contract.
Yeah, it's hard to give more specific advice without knowing more about the situation. 3 years does sound a little bit long, and it might be worth kind of asking more status updates to the publisher without being too annoying, to at least gauge some kind of communication, I guess. So a question now from Lubna. What is the etiquette regarding sending out thank you notes for rejection letters from agents? Is it something that a writer should do, or is it simply bothersome, or is it something you should never do? Scott, maybe you want to take this one?
I wouldn't bother, to be honest, unless an agent or publisher has gone to particular lengths to give you some feedback and perhaps requested that you resubmit once you've done the work. That may be worth a thank you note. To be honest, we're all really busy, and once we've rejected something, we move on. It's not that we don't care, it's just that we've got other things to do. So I really wouldn't bother, to be honest. And don't do what one author did and send a black feather in the post after receiving a rejection. Take your rejection in good grace, move on to the next agent or publisher. That would be my advice.
A black feather is pretty original.
They certainly weren't forgotten, but then of course agents and publishers do talk to each other, so we all know about it.
Now another question for you, Scott, because you're in Europe. So Mauricio Ruiz says in the US there are a lot of opportunities for writers to meet agents. So there's a Muse in the Marketplace, Writers Digest Conference. What opportunities are there for writers living in Europe? That includes the UK still.
Yeah, I mean certainly in person it's a bit more tricky. You often get agents and publishers talking at literary festivals, so it's always worth checking out the program for your local literary festival. I'll be honest, I think Twitter is a great place to hang out. So many UK and US and European agents are very active on Twitter and very happy to answer questions and often create hashtags for, I mean, there is an Ask the Agent hashtag in the UK, which a whole bunch of agents get involved with every now and again. So personally, I hang out on Twitter to see what the agents are saying, and if they invite people to ask them questions, then feel free to ask. In person is a bit more difficult, but festivals and those sort of events are worth checking out. And then every now and again there will be an organisation or a writers group will organise a live event. I've certainly done some speed dating, as they call it, for authors with their manuscripts. So yeah, just keep an eye out for that sort of thing.
Yeah, try a Google search. Try looking at writers and artists. I know they do meet the agents often in London, meet the agent events. Look at conferences. There's not a lot of them, but there's a really cool conference called Women's Fiction Festival, which you can attend even if you're not a woman. And it's held in Matera, beautiful Italian city, which I recommend absolutely to everyone. So basically it's a great opportunity to see a great city in Italy and meet a few agents who are much more relaxed when they're there than when they're working. Question on historical fiction now. Where do you see the genre of literary historical fiction trending? Generally speaking, are acquirers seeking specific, more distant eras, or are they open to more recent history? Anyone who has historical fiction experience can take this question.
I might jump in as it's silent. I can answer this question and also pick up on something else. We're often asked what's trending, what are people looking for? Yeah. And although occasionally there will be something specific, in general we just want a great book. Many of the biggest sellers out there have been books that have broken the rules and broken the mold and weren't necessarily on trend. So, you know, although clearly historical fiction set in Tudor times is very popular in lots of countries, it doesn't mean that something set in the 1920s won't sell. So we're far more concerned with the quality of the writing and the quality of the storytelling than we are necessarily with the timing of historical fiction. That being said, if a publisher or agent has a particular speciality, they'll probably make that clear, and then you can target them if you need to.
Yeah, that's good advice regarding trends. Do any of you recommend working with a writing coach as you're writing your novel? What is the benefit of this? I've got very mixed opinions on writing coaches, so maybe someone else wants to take this one if you're familiar with that profession.
No, what is a writing coach?
It's an excellent question. That's all the point. It would be similar to a developmental editor, but who's a mix between a developmental editor and a ghostwriter who's gonna help the author with the outline, then the writing, and also motivate the author to write. So there's a part of developing a writing routine as well in there. It's often more for nonfiction and busy kind of entrepreneurs who want to write a book. I think we're gonna skip that question. If you feel you need a writing coach, approach some, but I'd say write the book and then hire a developmental editor once you've revised the book a couple of times. When it comes to starting off, now a question from Julian Lee. When it comes to starting off, I sometimes use a prologue. Should I show the prologue to agents that request the first X pages of my manuscript, or should I just show them part of the first chapter?
Can I answer that one?
Yeah.
I have strong feelings about prologues. I don't think they're necessary when somebody tells you to send the first 3 chapters or your query. The prologue so rarely relates to what the actual story is going to be. Like, it's oftentimes a scene from the end of the book, or it's talking about like a history, and it doesn't give a good feel of what to expect. So I think it's wasting your opportunity to make a good impression. So I don't recommend it.
Yeah, mixed feelings about prologues as well. Now switching to dialogue tags, which we mentioned during the revision. Frank Yasenda says, I think when it's clear who is speaking, no dialogue tags at all are needed, and this can make for more effective dialogue. Do your panelists agree, and in particular, Katrina?
I think it depends how long the dialogue's been running. So once you establish the speakers, if it's 2 speakers in the conversation and they're sort of tagging back and forth, then I think you can drop the dialogue tags. I think you do often need a refresher. So if you have dialogue that's like exceeding a page, or runs the entire page with no sort of action to break it up or anything like that, which I wouldn't recommend. I'd recommend breaking it up with action. But should you have that, then I think you're going to need a reminder of the speakers, and so you might insert another couple of dialogue tags somewhere in there so that the reader doesn't get lost. But otherwise, yes, I think that at a certain point, if it's well established and very clear, you can drop them for the short sort of conversation and not have to have it after every single sentence in the dialogue.
Yeah, no, I see a lot of questions. I mean, I haven't tackled even 10% of the questions we got, I think. So I'm really sorry, and we're not going to be able to do it because we've been going for an hour and 40 minutes now. So we should wrap this up pretty soon. But I see a lot of questions around dialect tags, wordiness, all the kind of 6 things we mentioned, common hurdles to watch out for when you're revising your novel. When I'm going to send back the slides, there will be a link to a blog post or resource below each of these 6 points so that you can learn more about it and kind of see what other Reedsy editors have to say about it, so that you can go more in depth on these different topics. Now, a question about editors. So if I have from Monica, so if I have a few months of revision ahead of me, should I try to find an editor now so we'll be both ready at the same time? I think the answer to that is yes, right? Anyone?
Yeah, absolutely. No, go ahead, Katrina.
No, I think I actually answered that in our chat, and yes, I think the more in advance, the better, because as mentioned, editors tend to book months in advance, and rush jobs are not really ever recommended, especially if you want the highest quality of work on your manuscript. So I think the earlier the better. I don't think it hurts, actually.
Yeah, I agree. Often the authors are a little bit worried because they haven't finished revising the manuscript, so they don't want to send a sample that hasn't been revised. I'd say revise your first chapter, send that as a sample, and then while you're revising the rest, kind of make sure you book the editor for when you're going to be ready with the rest of the revision. Now, question: is there a list of professional editors like Writers Digest Guide to Literary Agents? This probably came in before I talked about Reedsy, but just in case there's Reedsy, that's what our marketplace is for, and that's what we set out to build. A curated list of super professional editors across all the stages of editing, but with a particular focus on developmental, as we've seen today. And another question, does Reedsy identify the editor's areas of interest, such as adult fiction or middle grade or young adult? Yes, we do. So every editor on Reedsy has a profile with their portfolio, their work experience, and the genres they specialize in. And then you can search our marketplace by the genre and by the location, also type of English if it's UK English or US English. And finally, last question we're going to be able to take on. Besides editing services, Reedsy also offer help finding an agent once the manuscript has received editorial help. So I'm going to say no, but I'm going to say as well that most of our editors who have traditional publishing background and offer editorial assessments are also going to offer a query letter review. So maybe, Scott, you want to talk a little bit about that? How do you help authors find an agent as a freelance editor?
Yeah, it sort of depends. I mean, certainly, most of the editors on Reedsy, if they read a book and edited a book that they absolutely loved, and they were convinced that they knew someone who would like it, whether that's an agent or a publisher, then they'd almost always spread the word. And certainly occasionally I've been taken on. I mean, I've done a job where someone has said, I want you to work on my edit, and then can you advise me on where to send it? And on one occasion I knew exactly the perfect person for it, and the book got picked up and published, and that's great. So I think we're happy to, as long as we're asked, we're happy to help if we can, and if we can't, we'll say so. So there's no harm in asking.
Anyone disagree or agree with that? All right, I think they share Scott's opinion. All right, well, We've been going for 1 hour and 45 minutes. I think we're going to need to wrap this up because I personally will need to wrap this up. So thanks so much for attending. Thanks so much, Katrina, Erin, Constance, and Scott, and Jim, who already left, for attending and helping with all these questions and with your insights. It's been really a pleasure. I've learned a lot personally, and I had already seen most of your answers before. So I'm sure the audience learned a lot as well. As I said, you can drop me a line, ricardo@reedsy.com, for more questions. Even if they're directed at our editors, I can forward them. And remember this little link. You'll get the slides, you'll get the replay of the presentation. So you'll be equipped to then hopefully sign up to Reedsy, and we'd love to help you. Sue, if you want to say something to wrap this up or stop the recording. Thank you, Sue, and thanks again to all the editors who took part.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al.